Welcome to your online lecture for the first half of Chapter 11. In this chapter, we quest for the historical Jesus. For Christians, Jesus of Nazareth is more than just a historical figure, but the Christ of faith. In this chapter, we take a step back and ponder the historical Jesus, the Jesus that lived 2,000 years ago in Israel. Since the death and resurrection of Jesus 2,000 years ago, there have been countless attempts to write about the life of Jesus. These include the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as non-canonical Gospels. Fad works that connect Jesus with the latest trends in pop culture have also emerged, as well as devotional works. Historical and biographical works are among the other attempts to write about the life of Jesus. Besides the writings, consider for a moment the artistic, dramatic, and the cinematic depictions of the life of Jesus. For most biblical scholars, readers should be aware of books that seek to distance Jesus from the Jewish world of his time, or that give a negative account of Judaism of Jesus' time. Professor Levine's 7 distortions and misconceptions of Jesus and first-century Judaism that continue to plague biblical scholarships are outlined in page 216 in your textbook. According to Levine, Jesus cannot be understood unless he is understood through the lens of first-century Judaism. Jesus dressed like a Jew, prayed like a Jew, instructed other Jews on how best to be obedient to the commandments, argued like a Jew, and like many other Jews at the time, was crucified by the Roman government. Readers should also be on guard for anachronistic portrayals that do not fit the Jewish village agrarian world recovered by archaeology and portrayed in the Gospels, such as making Jesus out to be a Hellenized philosopher. Before the advent of the critical historical method, which we have been covering in the course, serious attempts to reconstruct the life of Jesus were essentially harmonized retellings of the Gospels, often following John's chronology and perhaps elaborated from extra-canonical sources, usually the author's imaginations. These continue to be written. Consider for a moment Christmas plays. These are often harmonizations of the 3 Gospels which have infancy narratives, namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For a literary historian and literary critic, these are difficult since the intentions of each of the authors are being ignored by harmonizing the 3 stories. By the 1800s, many biblical scholars critique this approach of harmonizing, but most especially elaborating using the author's own imaginations. Many times, these depictions of Jesus are reflections of the authors themselves rather than the historical Jesus. The introduction of critical historiographic techniques into the study of the New Testament has led to several sorts of treatments of Jesus. During the 19th century, critical scholars engaged in the so-called quest for the historical Jesus. This sought to disconnect the Christ of faith from the Jesus of history. They asked, is there a historical Jesus buried under all the layers of our faith understanding of Jesus? Some thought Jesus was entirely a mythical creation, since there is no historical evidence that Jesus ever existed. This has been discredited, since their attempts come from a particular ideological agenda, and since they lack serious attention to the historical evidence. Some went to the other extreme and declared that the historical Jesus was unknowable, since it is difficult to get behind the interpretation of Jesus in the Gospels to any actual events. Some said that we can only construct a biography based only on what could be said. Consider for a moment what you think. Do you think it is possible for us to search for a historical Jesus beyond the Christ of faith? In the 1990s, the Jesus Seminar was created. This was originally an interest group formed in the Society of Biblical Literature to study the question of which of the sayings attributed to Jesus by the Gospels he actually said. They developed a criteria to determine authentic sayings of Jesus. About 100 New Testament scholars became regular participants, and many more were occasional participants. Members decided to record their collective opinion of respective sayings by dropping colored balls in a box like voting. Red meant that Jesus definitely said it. Pink, he probably said it. Gray, he probably did not say it. And black, he definitely did not say it. The results of these votes, annotated by summaries of the discussions beforehand, were published as the Five Gospels. This includes the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, an early sayings collection of great interest to modern scholars. There have been highly emotional outbursts against the work from various quarters. There are two substantive flaws. First, the members lack the background in Jewish studies. And second, the results are subjective, though there are extensive notes explaining the considerations that led to their conclusions. It's important to note that if the question, "Is it possible to write a life of Jesus?" is translated as, "Can you prove or disprove the theological claims that the Gospels make about Jesus?" then the answer must be no. In other words, the historical method cannot answer theological questions. However, it might clarify them. For example, it can discover what a religious idea, such as Messiah, could have meant to various groups of people in particular times and places. The historical method cannot prove if Jesus was really the Messiah. A historian constructs a picture of the world in which Jesus lived using literary and historical analysis, models from the social sciences and archaeology. Responsible historians and biographers are guided by the data and report their data dispassionately, whether those findings are congenial or not congenial to their own convictions. Constructing a biography of Jesus is challenging because it may call into question one's doctrinal views that are friendly or hostile to Christianity. This leads us to the first discussion question. Historical or scientific methods cannot verify or falsify theological or faith claims. In our world, then, what is the value of historical investigations of religious literature, religious leaders, movements, and other phenomena? Is it just an interesting pastime for history buffs, or does it have some value for religious thought and practice today? Since the Gospels are written from a religious perspective, the historian should approach those sources with care. There are relatively few extra-canonical or outside Bible references to Jesus in classical sources. This is not surprising, since Jesus was not prominent in a world where wonder workers, religious teachers, and martyrs to Roman authority were quite commonplace. However, for historians, the quality of sources is much more important than the quantity. The Jewish Roman historian called Josephus had writings that included several references to Jesus, as well as mention of John the Baptizer and James, the brother of Jesus. Josephus refers to Jesus in his 18th book of the Antiquities. Here, he notes Jesus' role as a religious teacher, his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, the traditions of his resurrection, and the notion that the prophets had foretold a great deal about him. It is likely, however, that his history was retouched by Christian editors. The most important reference to Jesus occurs in a passage about his brother James in the Antiquities. Here, Josephus identifies James as the brother of Jesus, the alleged Christ. When the 4th century Christian historian Eusebius cited this passage, he inverted Josephus's Greek word order so that it read something more like Jesus who is called Christ. This is the sort of reference to Jesus we might expect from a Jewish writer who is not a Christian convert. It is particularly impressive to historians because of the innocent and offhand manner of its presentation. Forgers and interpolators are generally much more ponderous, serious, and heavy-handed. Another ancient source is the Roman historian Tacitus, a near contemporary of Josephus. In his narration of the Great Fire of Rome, he noted that Nero had blamed it on the Christians and subjected them to vile and vicious treatment in public spectacles. Tacitus names the founder of the group as Christus, who suffered the extreme penalty at the hands of Pontius Pilate. His date for Jesus corresponds with Luke chapter 3 verse 1 and the implications of Luke chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 2, that Jesus was born during the reigns of Augustus and Herod the Great. These two references should be adequate to establish that Jesus was in fact a historical personage. They anchored several important data about Jesus gathered from the New Testament. That is, he lived during the reign of Tiberius, He was executed on orders of the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, that messianic claims were lodged on his behalf whether he made them or not, and that he had a brother named James. When questing for the historical Jesus, one wonders how the Gospels, a faith document, can be used as a source. There are two temptations regarding the use of the Gospels in the quest for the historical Jesus. First, to completely rely on them as historical sources, and second, to completely deny the Gospels as historical sources altogether. Form criticism and redaction criticism offer evidence that the traditions contained in the Gospels were shaped to meet the needs, concerns, and interests of the developing church. When we study each of the Gospels, we'll pay attention to some of the critiques from both form and redaction criticism. Redaction criticism tries to demonstrate how the Gospels crafted traditions to emphasize their particular insights. For most biblical scholars, it would be equally irresponsible to ignore the Gospels as historic sources. After all, unbiased sources are not the norm. Historians know to use both friendly and unfriendly sources. Some form critics assume that the Church of the Hellenistic world alone are the origin and shape the Gospel traditions. However, recent research has suggested that a substantial portion of the tradition units in the Gospels reflects a background in first-century homeland Judaism. Serious critical historians could make the following assertions about Jesus. First, he was a Galilean Jew of the early 1st century CE. Second, he was a teacher and wonder-worker and taught a love doctrine. Third, messianic claims were made for him. And finally, he was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. These assertions are based on the non-Christian sources as well as a critical use of the Gospels. Gospel specialists have devised a criteria to judge which sayings attributed to Jesus by the Gospels are authentic. Multiple attestation means that the saying of Jesus is reported in more than one independent source. Linguistic suitability looks at the saying of Jesus, which would have been written in Greek. It looks at whether or not that Greek phrase is readily translatable back into Aramaic or Hebrew, Aramaic being the language that Jesus spoke. Coherence implies whether the saying of Jesus is consistent with other well-authenticated traditions. Embarrassing reports are sayings or stories not in the interest of the early church. For example, disparaging Gentiles in Matthew chapter 15, verse 26. The final criteria is dissimilarity. This says that a saying that can be paralleled in 1st century Jewish or Hellenistic moral teaching is probably not authentic. In other words, Jesus' teaching has to be unique. This criteria, however, is disputed by historians and anthropologists. A critical sifting of each unit of tradition is beyond the scope of an introductory text or course. However, the fundamental issue can be raised. Does the portrait of Jesus that emerged from a critical sifting of gospel lore present a person who fits into a background in 1st century CE homeland Judaism, or do we have a unique flying saucer man, an alien to this environment? This is not likely, as he would have difficulty communicating and being understood than the Gospels suggest. For example, the disciples are represented as getting the general idea, but misrepresenting it. Howard and Young propose to ask whether the portrait of Jesus fits historically, ideologically, and sociologically into the 1st century Jewish world. Preference is given to the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John moves further into the interpretation of Jesus' significance than the other three. When considering if a figure like Jesus fit historically, the following questions may be asked. Is the picture of Jesus derived from the Gospels historically credible? Does it coordinate with independent information about the history and topography of Israel in the first several decades of the 1st century? There are, to be sure, some minor issues of historical detail that cannot be totally resolved. For instance, if Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, as Matthew and Luke assert, apparently on the basis of independent sources, could Quirinius have been governor of Syria? And did the tax census ordered during his tenure fall at the right time to account for Jesus' being born in Bethlehem? The independent data may be ambiguous, but even if Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, errs on this matter, it is not an error within the historical ballpark and does not impeach his general accuracy. Jesus is identified with the village of Nazareth, a minor hamlet in those days located in Lower Galilee, overlooking the valley of Jezreel and a few miles southeast of the sometimes provincial capital of Sepphoris. He was pictured during his public career circulating among various towns of the area, with Capernaum as his apparent headquarters. Jesus lived and died in a land incorporated in the Roman Empire, and the Gospel narratives record that fact. The Gospels also reflect the Jewish denominations of the first century. At least one of Jesus' disciples can be identified as a zealot. The Pharisees appear as the most frequent opponents of Jesus in arguments. The Sadducees also appear, but less frequently, as would be expected, especially in Galilee. The Essenes are not mentioned. If they guarded their purity, as the Hellenistic writers say, and the Dead Sea Scrolls imply, this is not surprising. The tradition is aware of the dispute between Pharisees and Sadducees over resurrection. And finally, the Sanhedrin is the highest authority in Israel, but subject to Roman authorities. It is headed by the high priest, but includes both Pharisees and Sadducees. As mentioned, Jesus would not have received a responsive hearing had he been totally alien to this world. His teachings had to be close enough to the ideas current in his time to be comprehensible to his contemporaries. On a general level, he was familiar with the Hebrew Bible and drew heavily on it. Even though the Gospels cited the Septuagint, his usage reflects the Hebrew canon of Israel, not the more extensive Septuagint canon. Jesus declared the Torah valid and irrevocable. He frequented the synagogue in his hometown and in other communities he visited. In Jerusalem, Jesus and his disciples seemed comfortable around the temple, and the disciples continued to go there after the crucifixion and the resurrection experience. What denomination did Jesus belong to? If the evidence is used very selectively, Jesus could be made to appear as an Essene, Covenanter, Zealot, or even Jewish Gnostic. The closest relationship that can be shown is between Jesus and the Rabbinic Pharisaic Judaism. After all, no teaching attributed to Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels is without its parallel in the Rabbinic literature. What then do we make of Jesus' disputes in the Synoptic Gospels with the Pharisees? First, detailed arguments are only possible between persons who share some common ground. And second, Jesus' disputes with the Pharisees are largely over questions of the correct understanding of Torah, a matter of mutual concern. The other main issue was his personal authority, because he seems to have ignored the rabbinic practice of citing sources. Finally, persons familiar with the rabbinic literature are aware that most of the disputes between Jesus and the Pharisees in the Gospels are similar to disputes among rabbinic authorities in their nature, subject matter, and intensity. In other words, they were family arguments. The title rabbi is closely associated with Pharisaic Judaism and its successor. Actually, the word became a formal title only after the time of Jesus, but its application to him is indicative. Does this mean then that Jesus was a Pharisee? We must balance our response with the fact that our understanding of the actual beliefs and practices of the Pharisees is very limited. Thus, Howard Young's answer is admittedly speculative. Jesus' closest ideological affinities did seem to be with Pharisaism. However, Jesus' Sabbath teaching was even more permissive than the Hillelites. He was apparently skeptical about the oral Torah. He based his own teachings on Midrash to a greater extent than seems to have been customary among Pharisees of his time. Remember, Midrash is a personal interpretation of the Bible. Finally, he apparently rejected the principle of authority of teachings. Instead, he stood for his own teachings, whether his own interpretation, or Midrash, or ad hoc. The Gospel of Matthew shows Jesus' endorsement of Pharisaic authority, even while it transmits his or their own reservations about the depth of some Pharisaic piety. If there is an irony here, it is that Matthew is, at the same time, the most Pharisaic of the Gospels. For example, to subscribe to the view of the near contemporary Akiva that there are no surplus words in Scripture, so that every single one must be interpreted. Thus, Matthew suggests that Jesus must have ridden two animals in the triumphal entry story. Jesus' affinity to contemporary Jewish centrism is further evidenced by his use of parables as a teaching device. He also typically utilized rabbinic forms of argument such as if, ... how much more? This is the light to heavy form common in rabbinic debates. Therefore, we may safely conclude that Jesus stood in basic ideological harmony with the Pharisees, but he entertained enough differences to justify the view that he was not simply a slightly deviant Pharisee. Regarding Jesus' sociological fitness, we ask, was there a place in first-century Israelite society in which a figure like Jesus, as portrayed by the Gospels, would fit? Jesus was accorded the title rabbi by both his followers and others. Further, his relationship to his immediate circle of followers was organized on the model of a rabbi and his disciples, his appointment of a special company of 12. The existence of a smaller company of 3, Peter, James, and John, was also typical for a great rabbi to have an inner circle of especially dedicated and beloved students, with whom he was most closely associated and to whom he communicated the most confidential teachings, including secret mystical lore. These general sociological data tend to confirm the affinity between Jesus and rabbinic Pharisaic Judaism, or at any rate, to locate them in the social world. Is a more precise definition possible? We considered a class of holy men called the Hasidim. Within this class are wonder-working saints described as charismatics, in other words, someone empowered with a special spiritual gift. The historian Weber noted 3 kinds of authority: the traditional, the rational, and the charismatic. Jesus also possessed rational authority. He was addressed as rabbi or teacher. But his additional charismatic authority set him apart from the Pharisaic leadership. Jesus seems to have been associated with a charismatic form of Judaism that was to be centered in Galilee. At least one of the Galilean charismatics, Hanina ben Doza, made it into the rabbinic chain of tradition. Like Jesus, he was a healer, even over long distances. Like Jesus, he was proclaimed Son of God by a Bath Ka'ol, voice from heaven. And like Jesus, Hanina apparently caused some discomfort in conventional Pharisaic ranks. This data is valuable in assessing Jesus' place in a first-century Jewish context. In other words, that there are fringes of rabbinism for someone like Jesus. The charismatic aspect of the ministry of Jesus, that is, the healings, resuscitations, exorcisms, and the few nature miracles attributed to him, has created the greatest problems of credibility for modern readers. Some interpreters try to explain the so-called miracles in scientific or philosophical terms, or else to explain them away. Anthropologists know very well that the holy men and women of most pre-technical societies were believed to work wonders. Ordinary folks have generally accepted wonders of their holy people, and they have seldom been disappointed. In any case, Jesus is not represented as using the wonders as a means of persuading people to believe. If people are not persuaded by the Torah and the prophets, they are unlikely to be convinced by a dead man, as it says in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31.